There is a famous saying in Tai Chi literature that states that one must have the 5 elements in the feet and the 8 trigrams in the hands. Now, this has been called the master key of Tai Chi. It is a fundamental set of principles by which the art is defined by many people, and by which the Tai Chi practitioner is judged. The concept of the 5 elements in the feet and the 8 trigrams in the hands can be applied to just about any martial art, not only Tai Chi. But it is said that if any martial artist of any style can apply the principles of the 5 elements in the feet and the 8 trigrams in the hands, then he or she will be doing Tai Chi. Or maybe it just means really good martial arts. But here is the problem. The expression, the 5 elements in the feet and the 8 trigrams in the hands, is of course absolutely meaningless to most people and is misunderstood by just about everyone else. That is one of the problems with esoteric terminology. It was not written for people to understand. It could probably be better thought of as a code or a test. Ask some people what it means and they will either spend hours talking about it and demonstrating their deep and profound understanding, or they will quote by rote from what other people have written. There are many people who could write a description of Einstein's special theory of relativity, but don't really understand it or its implications. The 5 elements in the feet can be about relative position, about change, about interaction, about the mind and the body and the intent. It can be about transmutation, among other things. They involve first person, second person, and third person perspectives. Most people, when they talk about the 5 elements in the feet, will refer to advancing and retreating, looking left, gazing right, and central equilibrium. That actually implies far more than it seems to imply. And unless you actually know what the teacher is talking about, then you'll be missing out on a lot of the more subtle and profound and broad implications of that idea. But let's see if we can get some of the confusing stuff out of the way first so that we can start talking about things that make sense. The 5 elements refers to an ancient idea that has existed all over the world, that the universe is made up of fundamental elements or fundamental principles or fundamental types of change, and that everything in the universe can be described as corresponding to these things or being made up of these things. Nowadays, school children learn about the periodic table of the elements. You learn hydrogen, helium, lithium, beryllium, boron, carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, fluorine, neon, sodium, magnesium, aluminum, silicon, phosphorus, sulfur, chlorine and argon, potassium, calcium, Scandinavians, Titanic, Vulcans, Cro-Magnon, Ironic, cobalt, Nicholas the policeman, galgadonium, germanium, arsenic, selena, bromance, superman, rubidium, strontium, person, woman, man, camera, TV, and so on. In the time of Aristotle, folks learned about air, earth, water, and fire, and these were philosophical elements of the universe. Later, people tried to apply a sort of a scientific method to those 4 elements. They would do observational and experimental tests to figure out whether it was made of air or fire or water or earth. In ancient China, they had 5 elements because 4 just did not cut it. They were metal, water, wood, fire, and earth. And these represented fundamental states of being or permutations or types of change. But nobody really knows what they mean, and the meanings change with each context in which they are applied. And boy, oh boy, do they get applied in a lot of different contexts. The elements can be used as metaphors and mnemonics and analogies and comparisons and even what do they call it? Look, what do you call it? What's another word for thesaurus? The elements can relate to planets or colors or days of the week or cardinal directions, seasons, mental states, emotions, internal organs, senses, parts of the anatomy, different body fluids, different fingers, flavors, smells, the ages of a person, animals, time of day, time of year, relative direction, the direction of your relatives, and much, much more. The basic five-element theory states that the different phenomena in the universe can have qualities corresponding to one of the five elements: metal, water, wood, fire, and earth. And these five elements interact with each other in different ways: constructive and destructive and overwhelming and insulting and so on. So there is a constructive cycle in which wood feeds fire, fire nourishes the earth, earth gives rise to metal, metal gathers water, and water nourishes wood. There's also a destructive cycle in which wood restrains earth. It keeps it from washing away. Earth restrains water, it absorbs it or dams it up. Water quenches fire, fire melts metal, and metal splits wood. There is also a regulating cycle, an overwhelming cycle, and an insulting cycle. And if you combine the overwhelming cycle and the restraint cycle, you get a game that is very much like a game of rock, paper, scissors, lizard, Spock. In some martial contexts, the elements describe different types of striking. So metal corresponds to splitting, water corresponds to drilling, and wood is crushing. Fire is smashing, and earth is sideways or shearing. And metal can restrain wood, and fire can restrain metal. Water can restrain fire, earth can restrain water. In traditional Chinese medicine, the five elements correspond to 6 different organ systems in the body. So 12 organs, 6 different systems, 5 elements. I know, 5 elements equals 6 systems. Just blame it on Taoism or Confucianism and move on, okay? A simple interpretation of the 5 elements in the feet is to say that the legs are responsible for attacking, for retreating, for dodging, for entering, and for central equilibrium. But this is a Taoist art, and because it's a Taoist art, it never really means what it means. The people who wrote this stuff never really had any intent of making it comprehensible to people who did not already understand it. This was not a manual that could be disseminated. It was more of a touchstone, a reference, a code, poetic inference for a bunch of really interesting concepts. It wasn't just about simple movements. The people who wrote it didn't write it for you. They wrote it for their students who were studying with them at the time. And they figured there's no point in writing it for ordinary people because, well, if I explain it to you in a way that you understand, then you will think that you understand. You'll think that you understood what you thought I said, but you won't realize that what you heard is not really what I meant. So they write it down in ways that makes no sense to any sane people, and the result is that only crazy people think that they get it. And now those crazy people have YouTube channels and they talk about it to people like you. The truth is that the 5 elements in the feet refers to so many subtle principles that there's really no point in going into it any further with a classical Chinese explanation. So instead, let's take some of these principles apart and see if we can deconstruct them in plain language and see what we come up with. In Tai Chi and other martial arts, there are things that the legs should do, and there are some things that the arms should do. If the arms try doing the job of the legs, then we may end up walking on our hands and requiring feet that have opposable thumbs. The human body is quite adaptable, but for our purposes today, we will assume that we are standing upright, or at least sitting upright. Some of this stuff can be applied sitting in a chair. First, the 5 elements in the feet refers to the 6 degrees of freedom being controlled by the legs. I know the 5 elements equals 6 degrees. Let's move on. If you are familiar with flying an airplane, or robotics, or video game design for that matter, then you are probably familiar with the 6 degrees of freedom. The 6 degrees of freedom describes the different ways that a solid object can move within 3-dimensional space. And these 6 degrees are 1. Surge, which is forward and back on the x-axis. Heave, which is up and down on the z-axis. Sway, which is like moving left and right along the y-axis. Then there's pitch, which is tilting forward and backward on the y-axis. Yaw, which is turning side to side, pivoting on the z-axis. And roll, which is tilting side to side on the x-axis. If you try to apply any of the 6 degrees of freedom to any part of the body individually, you need to do that using the part that is below it. So because of gravity, something beneath it has to move it. So for the finger can do a little bit of roll and pitch, but it can't yaw, and it certainly can't sway, surge. You can try, like that. Part of it can, I suppose. There's surge and heave, but not much yaw, and there's not a heck of a lot of roll, and so on. If I want to do the same thing with a hand, I can pitch and I can roll, but there's not a lot else that it can do. The shoulders can protract and retract. They can do a lot of these movements, but in doing so, they compromise the structural integrity of the body. They reduce the amount of power and the amount of momentum that I can transfer into my target. They make the body weaker. When the shoulder does this, it cannot lift very much. It has to be in place. And when it's back here, it cannot lift as much. It has to be there. So keeping the shoulder still relative to the torso is important for maintaining the structure and the power of the body and of any action that I might be doing. The chest can do a fair bit as far as the 6 degrees of freedom, but that's only because the waist can move it. So the waist can cause the chest to heave and surge and sway and pitch and yaw and roll. And that can be done using the waist without moving the pelvis. That's actually a good exercise. But in application, in martial arts, doing that compromises the structure. You make the connection to the ground a lot weaker. And so you don't have the power in the legs being transmitted effectively through the body. The waist is extremely agile, or can be if you train it. So can the spine, so the thoracic vertebrae. You want it to be able to do all of these things as well. So when we say that the 6 degrees of freedom are in the legs, it is most effective in the legs. In the upper body, it's more of a way of compensating or adjusting to changes. It's not a proper way of actually generating power or receiving or absorbing things. The real reason for the agility of the spine is to preserve or adapt the structure, not to actually generate movement. I'm not going to be able to attack you with my chest. I have to use my legs. That sort of makes sense. Yeah, I think so. Okay, next. In the last episode, we talked about reducing the reliance on class 3 levers, like this, and so on, in favor of class 1 and class 2 levers. This means that the arms do not move very much relative to the torso. Instead, the arms are stabilized in optimal positions while the core of the body, the hips and the legs, do most of the work. There are exceptions to this rule, but they are exceptions to the rule, and we may or may not talk about them at another time. The reality is that in order to eliminate the class 3 lever syndrome and improve your mechanical advantage, you need to use your legs for the 6 degrees of freedom. Experienced boxers and grapplers will understand this. You punch with the legs. You apply power with the whole body. Throws are done from the core. It's not done with the hands. It's done with the legs. So we may ask, why don't we just say the legs control the 6 degrees of freedom instead of saying the 5 elements are in the legs? Well, there's that pesky Dunning-Kruger thing again. See, in a martial context, we have to consider the relationships between direction, movement, position, momentum, and intent, among other things. So I can have the body or the mind align with a particular direction and yet move in another. I can be retreating while I'm attacking. A good boxer can knock an opponent out while running backwards with a left jab. I can be retreating while I'm attacking, and both of these things are determined by the legs. So I'm not retreating and the arm is going forward while the body is going backwards. I am surging. There's a negative surge. There might be a negative heave. There's also a yaw, maybe a pitch, and maybe even a roll as I go back and punch. Likewise, when I'm coming forward, I may have surge and sway and pitch and yaw and roll. All of this at the same time. And the direction that I am going is not necessarily the structure that I am holding. People will often watch a video of a martial arts demonstration and say, oh, well, if he did that, I would do this. And I say, but if you did that, he wouldn't have been doing that. And how do you know if he is in the right structure there to actually succumb to that thing that you think you're going to be able to do? Because you don't really know, because what he's doing is not the way he is. And that's another video. Anyway, I can have the body and or the mind aligned in a particular direction and move in another direction. I can be retreating while I'm attacking. Both of these actions are determined by the legs. I can combine the 6 degrees of freedom with different types of internal alignment in order to confound and confuse my opponent and increase my own options. When we learn a martial art, we start by paying attention to how we move within the 3-dimensional framework. But there are more than 3 dimensions to be concerned about. For one thing, there is the time factor. There is also the relationship with the opponent's body and mind. We may know all about our position in 3D space, but there are relationships between different positions. There are ways in which these different positions and movements can be combined with each other. Then we have the relative perspectives. So after we learn about what we are doing from a first-person point of view, then we have to think about the second-person and the third-person perspectives. So we look at, what am I doing with regards to the 6 degrees of freedom? How am I being while I am doing that? So I may start out in a particular shape in this position, but when I move forward, I change to a different structure. When I'm attacking, I might start out with a fly swatter and end up with an axe. So this can change in the course of the movement. So you have to think about not only what you are doing, but how you are at any given point in time while you're doing that.
Scotty, did you reset the Heisenberg compensators?
We also have to think about what I am doing to the opponent, and what the opponent is doing, and what the opponent is doing to me, and how is my opponent being when they are doing that. All of these things change in a millisecond, and we need to be able to adapt. Of course, just as an airplane pilot does not have to be consciously analyzing all of these things all of the time, a martial artist does not need to be thinking about all of these things consciously all of the time. They need to become natural and intuitive. It will become a natural instinct. We have to train ourselves to have natural instinct, however. But understanding the complexity will enable you to empower your practice, to be able to deconstruct these things and build them up and create something that is much greater than the sum of its parts. That is all that I'm going to say about this stuff right now. In a future video, I will talk about the 8 trigrams in the hands. Until then, remember, if you understand what I have been talking about, you probably were not listening.
Congratulations on making it to the end of one of my videos. That is quite an accomplishment. If you would like to see more of these videos, then please visit sinclairinternal.arts.com, where you can make a one-time donation, or subscribe or sign up for a private online lesson. If you would like to see fewer of these videos, that is going to cost you.